All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming up here on a Sunday morning. And sorry to those who came up early, so at 9 a.m. There were a few. So we realized yesterday that the subway doesn't start until 9. So we changed the schedule. And we're going to continue changing the schedule, unfortunately, because one of our speakers today, Kevin Sutton, couldn't make it. So we only have one panel this morning. So we're going to go straight till lunch. This panel is going to go straight to lunch. So you have, about 20 minutes each, but I guess I'll give a little bit more leeway because we're a bit more flexible.
We like more leeway.
Yeah. All right, so the first speaker is Troy, which I guess everyone knows is one of the co-organizers of the conference. He's a partner and a father, a PhD student in social and political thought, and his research interests are business history, anarchism, and resistance. And the second speaker is Nicholas, who's a PhD student in comparative political economy at University of Toronto. And he specializes in Latin America, and he did his undergrad here at York, including a few classes under Jonathan Nitzan. And the third speaker came all the way from the San Francisco Bay Area and is active in the peace and disarmament movement for the past 30 years for 2 NGOs in particular. And he is able to eat by doing law on the side. And so, take it away, Troy.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to start off just with kind of, in general terms, what it is I'm trying to do. And this is really what is guiding all of my research, with this as one particular component of what has come out of that research. The big thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to localize the global. I'm trying to remind us that all of these big structures that we come to, us theoreticians come to see as ruling our lives, they take place in the most immediate and local of places. So even capitalization, it occurs at computer terminals, over telephones, in offices. All of this has to occur someplace, and it's always some identifiable place. There are no external, transcendental forces ruling our lives. There really is only what is local. And one of the reasons I like the capital's power approach is it emphasizes this empirical component. To that end, I also feel like I'm bridging the quantity-quality element that has come up again and again during this conference. It involved a lot of misunderstanding on people's parts about where the diverse qualities of the world fit into what they saw as an overly quantified perspective. And with this presentation, I hope to demonstrate how quantity and quality do fit together. The third thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to subject business to the same critical gaze that other social institutions have really been subject to for a couple of centuries. The institutions that make up the political realm, for lack of a better term at the moment, they've been subject to that sort of critical examination by outsiders for a long time. Business studies, as it stands right now, is almost entirely made up of people who are within the world of business, and it's really a tactical, strategic study. How can we do what we do better? And I shorthand what I do as being critical business studies with my investigation of Diamonds and De Beers, really sort of a case study or an enactment of that critical business studies rather than more of a theoretical development in and of itself. So the title of my paper has changed, as most of them did, I believe. In fact, I don't even fully remember it, so I'm going to have to read it. It is now The Simple Rules of Diamonds, De Beers, Advertising, and Making the World. And I understand that the last phrase in the subtitle seems pretty grandiose. I hope to offer some justification for this phrase. The title itself you'll understand it more as we get into the presentation. So with the rejection of the labor theory of value, the capitalist power perspective really opens up a demand that we consider every element of the social world that has bearing on accumulation. There's no longer any grounds for believing that ultimately it rests on labor and only labor. And as has been hammered again and again by defenders of the theory, obviously labor is important, but it's not the only thing. So the next thing to consider, obviously, is the consumer. There are consumers, there is consumption. They're obviously important to business. How do we understand capital as power and the consumer? And I think we can think of the consumers as and the consumer-business relationship as one of capture and retention, where businesses try to divert consumer spending and they try to secure consumer spending. They seek to achieve loyalty. They often speak in terms of, brand loyalty. However, the control of consumers by business is not qualitatively the same as the control over the means of production, where through the mechanisms of legal ownership, business commands production. Consumers, they don't own us. They merely try to persuade us. And I think that introduces a great degree of risk and uncertainty to business, because there is no grounds to automatically ensure our continued loyalty. And there's always a risk of defection, certainly not from capitalism itself without a grand social movement, but from one business to another. And we have to recognize that individual businesses take that very seriously, and it is a concern for them. And if we remember that this global system is local, the concerns of individual businesses are important because the aggregate is nothing more than all of those individual concerns. So I think that marketing is really the mechanism by which they've tried to reduce the uncertainty of consumer loyalty and their control over consumers. Marketing is an appeal to us, and really it appeals to the meaning of commodities. They try to make our consumption meaningful to us. And I think this meaning making we can think of as being part of the reorienting and the realigning of social structures that Herman described as what he considered the qualitative side of the capitalist power framework. Randy referred to it as shaping. I think marketing is an important component of that. And I think this reorienting, realigning, we also have to recognize as being an act of creation. So, and it's creation in the sense that Castoriadis meant, which is creation ex nihilo. It really is out of nothing. However, it's not creation cum nihilo or in nihilo, meaning there are no ingredients and there's no context. There obviously is. But in the realigning, the reorienting, the shaping, the reshaping of the existing social objects, there's some emergent component. There's something new. And I think if they weren't creating qualitatively new things, there would be no accumulation. Now, even though I'm referring to the making of meaning, this is not wholly a process of the mind. There are obviously very material contexts to that, and I hope that will come out in the discussion of how De Beers sought about to make meaning. So this graph is a demonstration of an accumulation crisis faced by De Beers in the early part of the 20th century. Just to explain the graph a little bit, and I have to explain some of De Beers' accounting practices, unfortunately. The light gray line is the profit, the yearly profit of De Beers itself relative to the earnings of the S&P 500. So you can see there's a great deal of profit volatility for De Beers itself. The thick black line is just the same thing as a 5-year moving average, just to smooth out some of the volatility and make clearer the general downward trend. Now, the dashed line is where things get a bit more complicated. So in the late 19th century, Cecil Rhodes and his business partners secured the De Beers cartel, as most people know. Less known is that almost immediately their monopoly began to erode, and other businesses emerged outside the control of the De Beers cartel. The details are very interesting. I can't go through them. In the 1920s, Ernest Oppenheimer re-secured the cartel. So the reason I had to do the dashed line was because De Beers was not the totality of the diamond industry, and I wanted to get the diamond business. I wanted to get a better picture of the diamond business as a whole. Now, this was pretty difficult because a lot of the players, even though they were entering, causing problems for De Beers, were still relatively small. Some of them only traded on the South African stock market in Kimberley. I have not been able to find any data for it. Even once Oppenheimer re-secured the De Beers cartel, he left a lot of these companies nominally distinct. And they had their own administration structure, they had their own reporting. So reporting by De Beers did not include reporting for these nominal companies that they still nonetheless controlled. So the X's are moments where I was able to get data on more of the companies than just De Beers, and this becomes significant after the 1940s, where for whatever reason, I'm not entirely sure, De Beers began to report on this consolidated, combined entity. I'm not uncovering some big thing by saying, we have all these different companies and, that Oppenheimer was secretly controlling. They were open about this. It was well acknowledged. We control all of them, but they weren't reporting them all together. Then in the 1940s, they start to do that, and they shift more of the profit within the diamond business to these other entities. And I'm not exactly sure why. They do it nonetheless. And so it becomes especially important that I'm looking at more than just De Beers reporting of its own profits. Okay. So they're facing an accumulation crisis, understood in differential terms, through the early part of the 20th century. This is both through boom and bust on the part of the global economy. Then in the beginning of 1940s, their fortunes reverse. And if people recall the graph that Jonathan had of the S&P 500 earnings, they were increasing. So even at a time of increasing earnings, De Beers was outperforming that. So why this crisis? I don't think it has to do with production. I think it has to do with cultural change. Changes in the perception of diamonds that are not independent of production itself. So the increasing supply of diamonds is changing the desirability of them. But the jewelers are lamenting the loss of this begloried aristocracy that are no longer festooning themselves in the most luxurious of objects, and the rise of this staid bourgeoisie who are wearing, boring suits. Diamond Jim Brady is an anomaly. He's called Diamond Jim Brady because it's strange that he is wearing all of these diamonds. So they're not buying diamonds in the same way. And I'd like to suggest, and this might be slightly provocative, that this actually is an instance of disobedience. This is an instance of disobedience to the institution of diamonds that had a negative effect on De Beers. And Herman talked about how he feels like differential accumulation is a measure of disobedience. And I would say that this is differential disobedience. It's not disobedience to capitalization, or capitalism, but it is disobedience that nonetheless we get a picture of by examining the quantitative side of things. So De Beers recognizes its own crisis, and it begins to ponder marketing for the first time. It hires N.W. Ayer, an American advertising company, who conduct a survey. And their survey seeks to capture the perspective of jewelers and the perspectives of the public. The jewelers are ready to participate in this. They are recognizing a crisis. They're seeing a decline in diamond buying. And even though the jewelers themselves are pretty intense competition among them, it's a very diverse industry, asked if they would increase their own advertising, this comes directly from the survey, if a national advertising program were undertaken by the Diamond Trading Corporation, 85.3% of the jewelers said yes. This is an unusual indication of a desire for support and a willingness to cooperate. Why are they willing to cooperate? Well, diamonds represent pretty close to half of store volumes. Diamonds are higher margins than the other things that they sell. And they are recognizing declining interest on the part of consumers. In part, consumers are moving to costume jewelry. Specifically within diamonds, engagement rings are important. They're 75% of the unit volume of diamonds, 70% of the dollar value. One jeweler refers to them as their bread and butter line. They are particularly concerned that the sizes of engagement rings are going down, and the value of engagement rings are going down. For cash jewelers, on average, people are buying a half carat worth about $150. Among credit jewelers, it's 20 points, which is 0.2 of a carat, for $60 to $75. The survey says, the fact that the typical amount invested in the purchase of an engagement ring is as low as is here indicated, coupled with the fact that an engagement ring is perhaps the symbol of love for another, suggests the need for persuading young men to spend a larger amount for the jewel, which should be more important to them and their fiancés than any they will acquire later in life. And we will see this exact sentiment turn up in the ads that NW Air does for De Beers. Additionally, there is a changing wedding tradition at this time that jewelers have identified, that rather than buy an engagement ring that has a sizable solitaire on it and a wedding band, instead they'll buy just a wedding band that the diamonds it contains are called melee. They're just those small diamond chips. So they're obviously much, much lower profit on those sorts of diamonds, and also leaves them without an outlet for these larger diamonds. The perspectives of the public, they surveyed them on taste, and they ascertained that the taste for diamonds was moving to smaller diamonds regardless of income. So even among the moneyed, they were preferring smaller sized diamonds. Large diamonds were seen as being slightly garish. And they also were testing them on their knowledge. How much do potential buyers know about diamonds? They found they were pretty accurate on size. They could say this was a quarter carat, half carat, 1 carat, 2 carat. They were not accurate on price. For example, the 1 carat stone worth in the neighborhood of $500 to $600, remember this is 1939, was estimated by 70.53%, I like the 2 decimal accuracy on that, of men, and 66.28% of the women as costing less than $400. The margin of error increases with the size of the stone. This popular belief that good quality diamonds cost far less than is actually the case makes it more difficult for the honest jeweler to impress his prospects that his prices for diamond jewelry are not exorbitant. When a prospective customer learns of the actual cost of a diamond of the size he may have had in mind, his sales resistance is immediately stiffened, and it is only human nature for him to feel that he is being imposed upon. Furthermore, the lack of knowledge about prices leads many people to accept the bargain prices of unethical retailers as true bargains. They also found that diamonds were still popular apart from price. People still like diamonds. Against every other jewel, they far surpass the desirability of every other jewel. So diamond advertising, I'll talk a little bit about. Before the discovery of diamonds in South Africa, diamonds were very, very, very rare. They were absolutely only the plaything of the rich. So a lot of my political economic predecessors also discussed diamonds, Bastiat, Marx, Smith, and there's a very good chance none of them have ever actually seen a diamond. They were so rarefied. Before De Beers entered the advertising realm, there was advertising being done by jewelers in the US. And I would say that those ads are pretty standard for the era. There really was nothing to set them apart, and there was a high degree of price competition as part of it. Price is one of the mechanisms you can use to compete, and that's what jewelers were using, particularly mail order jewelers who are, saying we have these bargains that we can offer. And these are some examples of pre-De Beers jewel ads. You can see $70 per carat, if you recall the price that NW Air identified as the true cost of a 1 carat stone, $500 to $600. So you can see how much they're under that. And they're really undermining the very diamond myth, the story of diamonds as rare, the story of diamonds as inherently valuable. So enter De Beers. De Beers ads are strikingly different. If you look through an issue of Life magazine, the ads have big glaring brand names. They're very focused on practical aspects. De Beers are not like that. De Beers have a large amount of white space, which is very unusual for the time. Look at the RCA ad. They fill every single square inch that they possibly can. And they're really making an emotional appeal. And they don't brand the diamond. De Beers Consolidated Minds is a very small element of this. They're marketing diamonds, not De Beers diamonds, diamonds. And I think that they're recreating the meaning of diamonds. They're not inventing the idea of the diamonds. It was already there. If you recall, diamonds win hearts. That emotional aspect is already there. De Beers did not invent that, but they did recreate it. They re-entrenched it. I would say that they restructured it. They were reinforcing a new structure of diamonds, which, okay, so I just wanted to go over a little bit of the content of these ads. So this is the very first ad in Life magazine De Beers ever did. And so this says, each man owes it to his future to give the most beautiful diamond he can buy. So here's a distillation of that exact strategy that they recommended. Now, this is teaching consumers. There are but a few simple rules for its selection. What are those rules? Go to a reliable jeweler. This is to get around these mail-order jewelers who are undermining the price of diamonds. It's re-establishing the jewelers whose goodwill De Beers has some dependence upon. Diamond prices vary with weight, color, quality, and cutting. This table will guide you from dubious bargains. And so then they provide, that should have been bigger again. They provide this table of what average prices are for diamonds. So returning to the chart, this advertising, I believe, is the reason they were able to achieve this miraculous turnaround. And the reason they were able to achieve this miraculous turnaround is not just the advertising itself, but the context in which the advertising took place. They were restructuring the meaning of diamonds as a symbol of love right at a moment where marriages suddenly skyrocketed because you had a whole mass of men returning from the war. So all of these men are returning from the war. For 5 or 6 years now, they've been really hammering home the idea of the diamond is the symbol of love. The diamond is the symbol of love. The diamond is the symbol of love. And these men go for it. And they really establish this as a tradition, not just because De Beers invented it, but because these men enacted it. And so even today, I have very practically minded friends who wanted and received diamond engagement rings. And when I asked them, why did you want a diamond? Like, you know they're not rare, right? It's like, yes, I know, but my mother had a diamond ring, my grandmother had a diamond ring, my great-grandmother, which probably isn't true, actually. So it's this tradition that gets created because the advertising happens at this particular moment. And so I think that this is an element of structuring and obedience, as Jonathan has discussed. Diamonds have become a habit. So it's not merely a psychological aspect, although that's obviously very important. It's really how that psychological aspect has translated into material practices. And those material practices are of massive consequence. Go to any diamond mining region today and see what the material consequences of this are. There is this psychological component cannot be wholly divorced from the material component, which returns me to my original points that this is about meaning and also matter, and it also is taking place at the absolute local level. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sean, for introducing me, and thank you to everybody who's organized this conference. It's been excellent. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to get two things off. First, I'd like to say that my paper is a preliminary inquiry into the broad macro-historical ebb and flow of capitalism's attempt to interpolate subjects Thus, it's not an exhaustive examination, but rather sets out as a guide for further research into the topic. Secondly, as we all know, the vibrant debate that's been happening over this weekend between differential accumulation, capitalization, and labor theory of value and utility theory is important, but it is outside the scope of my paper. So instead, my focus of my paper is to focus on one of the innovative terms used by Nitzan and Bischler, which is capitalism as a Creorder. I argue that the concept needs to be enriched and deepened in order to have a better understanding of how capitalism works as a material power, but also ideologically and politically. So one of the puzzles that confronts us, and Nitzan and Bischler highlight this puzzle very well, is with all the illogical empirical faults that neoclassical economics has, it remains the organizing, operative, or ideology of the capitalist nomos. I hypothesize that this is because neoclassical economics does not merely present itself as a scientific theory, but because, and more importantly, it is embedded in a tacit but ever-present liberal, ethical, political concept of the human subject, which is homo economicus of the possessive individualist genus. I take the Gramscian equation, philosophy equals ideology equals politics, very seriously, and I look into the broad philosophical, ideological, and political developments of the capitalist subject over time. Utilizing Gramsci's theoretical framework of ideological hegemony, I attempt to locate the ethical political base that cements capitalist subjectivity, which, when successful, creates a new common sense, solidifying the capitalist Creorder. Therefore, I accept the Gramscian argument that, and I quote, ideologies are the true philosophy, since they will turn out to be those philosophical popularizations that lead to the masses to create concrete action and to transformation of reality. So I use C.B. Macpherson's seminal work, Political Philosophy of Possessive Individualism, to elucidate the classical philosophical presuppositions of the liberal capitalist system. Next, I will consider briefly Friedrich A. Hayek's works, in particular the Road to Serfdom, in order to map out the ideological reaction against the counter-hegemonic discourses that try to rearticulate the possessive individualist subject and his rearticulation of it into the neoliberal variant that we know today. I then transition to the political plane with a brief exploration of social capital to investigate what insights it has in explaining the logic and implementation of neoliberalism in practice. Agreeing with Pierre Bourdieu, I put forward that neoliberalism seeks to undermine social capital in order to remove the non-economic obstacles to the full realization of the capitalist Creorder. So, Nitzan and Bischler present a challenge to critical theorists, and I quote, to change a capitalist world, one first needs to reconceive it, and that reconception means new ways of thinking, new categories, and new measurements, and I certainly agree. So, if ethical change is what was being sought, we need to both identify which mechanisms make capitalism a revolutionary and totalitizing system, but also we need to recognize that constant revolutionizing is simultaneously based on a foundational continuity and logic of the capitalist subject that informs the nomos. Capitalism is unique in that its main mode of organizing society, as we all know, is economic, via the extension of the price mechanism. So vital is this to capital that without it, capital would cease to exist. As Nitzan and Bischler argue, and I quote, capitalism cannot negate the market because it requires the market. Without a market, there can be no commodification, and without commodification, there can be no capitalization, no accumulation, and no capitalism. The mechanism of power is limited only by what capital is politically capable of commodifying. Therefore, given the appropriate intellectual and political circumstances, capital has the potential to be a truly universal system of power by making everything, quote, vendible. It is here where the hegemonic battle must take place, in order to make way for capitalism to become a universal Creorder or to prevent it from becoming so. The existence, extent, and subordination of society to the price mechanism is an index of the power of the capitalist Creorder. According to Nitzan and Bischler, value originates from the power that capital has over society through capitalization and sabotage. And I quote, to shape and restructure the course of social reproduction at large. Thus, what gets accumulated is the ability to subjugate creativity to power. Yet, as Karl Polanyi argues in The Great Transformation, the creation of an all-encompassing capitalist market system represents, and I quote, the beginning of a revolution as extreme and radical as ever inflamed the minds of sectarians. From the milieu of the fundamental transformations that took place in the 19th century, there emerged counter-hegemonic forces that Polanyi terms the double movement. Capitalism as a Creorder needs to prevent or preempt the double movement in order for it to function relatively smoothly and to prevent the democratization of the nomos. Therefore, capitalism depends on a stable ideological principle that cements an ethical conception of the subject that justifies this constant revolutionizing of social relations through the price mechanism as not only natural but rational. Gramsci notes that economic systems are based on an abstract conception of homo economicus that synthesizes, and I quote Gramsci, the economic activity of a particular form of society. It is the abstraction of the needs of the economic operations of a particular form of society into the subject. Homo economicus in capitalism has a particular philosophical history, content, and application, originating from the social contract theorists of England in the 17th and 18th centuries. Therefore, the capitalist concept of the rational subject is the fundamental challenge that critical theorists and economists face. Neoclassical economics is ultimately based on this ethical political concept. Therefore, Frederick Jameson argues, and I quote, "The market is in human nature is a proposition that cannot be allowed to stand unchallenged. In my opinion, it is the most crucial terrain of ideological struggle in our time," and I certainly agree. So, C.B. Macpherson, in his book, elucidates the core principle that underpins capitalism, the possessive individual, which is based on the well-known works of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. So, Hobbes, for instance, asserts that what animates human action in the state of nature is based on the idea of a general inclination of mankind, a perpetual and relentless desire for power after power that ceases only with death. Consequently, the accumulation of power is due to the notion that, and I quote, "the capacity of every man to get what he wants is opposed by the capacity of every other man. And the reason why such things as wealth and reputation are power is that they give defensive and offensive strength against others. Accordingly, rational behavior is reduced to only that which seeks to gain over and above others in a perpetual gain of attaining power for power's sake, otherwise the market system, and the prevention of competitors from taking over one's own freedom, or the naturalization of the ethic of capitalism. However, it is only when the institution of money is established that the Lockean spoilage limitation can be superseded, thereby negating all natural law limits from the property right. Money allows for the creation of potentially unlimited, peaceful accumulation of property or power. In the Lockean tradition, the otherwise innate negative qualities of human nature are now channeled into not only non-violent, but also positive and productive means, and this is taken to the extreme with Adam Smith with his invisible hand theory. The invention of money and accumulation creates scarcity, and there ceases to be unappropriated land. Inequality is justified on the premise that individuals are initially endowed with equal reason and capacities. The ethical implication is, and I quote, "If men are by nature equally rational, in the sense of equally capable of looking after themselves, those who have fallen behind in the pursuit of property can be assumed to only have themselves to blame. Accumulation and inequality thereby create the proletariat, who are ethically responsible for their own subordinate position. This drive towards accumulation has knock-on effects that drastically change the nature of every society, whereby individuals who have property join together to form government, a social contract, essentially. Thus, according to Macpherson, political society becomes a calculated device for the protection of this property and for the maintenance of an orderly relation of exchange. And the origins of the class state emerge from this imperative. The establishment of the class state must be coupled with an ideological component. Having a class state held together purely by force is too costly, and as a consequence, the moment of hegemony emerges. According to Gramsci, hegemony occurs when one becomes aware of one's own corporate interests, transcends the corporate limits of a purely economic class, and can and must become the interests of the other subordinate groups too, bringing about not only a unison of economic and political aims, but also an intellectual and moral unity, posing all the questions around the struggle rages not on the corporate but on the universal plane, and thus creating the hegemony of the fundamental social group over a series of subordinate groups. As Marx notes, ideas do not have an independent existence. Thus, Hobbes, Locke, Smith, etc., were among the most important intellectuals of the emerging market system in England after the cathartic moment of the Glorious Revolution. The creation of the possessive individual as subject, coupled with the later elucidation of economics, were revolutionary. Their conception of society and the human subject were progressive at the time of their propagation, and fit within the Gramscian concept of hegemony by incorporating into the symbolic order all individuals who were formerly excluded under feudal society. This therefore satisfies Marx's criteria that, and I quote, "every new class achieves dominance only on a broader basis than that of the previous class ruling. This new universal principle was mediated through the price mechanism, where all were considered individually and relations were seen as voluntary to the point where, according to McPherson, human society can only be a series of relations between sole proprietors, that is to say, a series of market relations. Nonetheless, regardless of this ethical principle, in the decades that followed the revolutions of 1848, the double movement was against the extension of the commodification, or the possessive market, was in full swing. In the first phases of the double movement that occurred in the 19th century, the discourse that would have united the mass under a singular banner was lacking. It would take the intervention of Karl Marx to give coherence to this disparate double movement, to transforming it into a truly counter-hegemonic force of history. Marx rejected the premises of liberal society, the homo economicus of the possessive genus. Marx sought to engage in a radical analysis, that is to say, and I quote, to grasp things by the root, but for man, the root is man himself. Marxism puts the possessive individualist conception of freedom on its head, as Max Horkheimer states, and I quote, freedom is not the freedom to accumulate, but the fact that I have no need to accumulate. Marx argued that the point of philosophy was not to interpret the world, but instead, I quote, the point is to change it. Marx had good reason to argue this point, because this was Hobbes and Locke. This is what Hobbes and Locke did with their philosophical interventions that shaped the capitalist Creorder into a universal project. Therefore, Marxism attempted to create a brodical ethical political concept for a revolutionary subject endowed with an eschatological narrative to incite radical change. It placed an emphasis on the epiphenomenal and oppressive nature of the state, which structures society to reinforce power inequality, a reversal of the possessive individualist philosophy. Therefore, politics had changed its content and form after the intervention of Marx, so much so that a new formulation of the political itself, as Gramsci argued, is it the intention that there should be rulers or ruled, or is it the objective to create the conditions in which the division is no longer necessary? In other words, is the initial premise the perpetual division of the human race, or the belief that the division is only a historical fact corresponding to certain conditions? However, it was only after the cathartic moment of the Russian Revolution and the Great Depression that the ethical political premises of liberalism were undermined and new hegemonic ideologies emerged. Particularly, the Great Depression created a foundation for, as Gramsci notes, a terrain more favorable to the dissemination of certain modes of thought as certain ways of posing and resolving questions. It was the intervention of John Maynard Keynes, the harbinger of a new era of liberalism and capitalism, which fundamentally challenged and eventually changed the hegemonic principles of liberal society. Keynes rejected not only laissez-faire economic policies that sprang from the possessive individualist project, Keynes also discarded the philosophical basis of possessive individualism himself when he argues that, and I quote, it is not true that individuals possess a prescriptive natural liberty in their economic activities. There is no compact conferring perpetual rights on those who have or on those who acquire. Keynes' dismissal of this individualist principle allowed him to advocate for a corporatist solution to the problems of capitalism, going so far as to state, and I quote, I propose a return, it may be said, towards medieval conceptions of separate autonomies. Even Franklin Delano Roosevelt argued, our Republican leaders tells us economic laws, sacred and variable and unchangeable, cause panics, which no one could prevent. But while they print of economic laws, men and women are starving. We must lay hold of the fact that economic laws are not made by nature, they are made by human beings. This is actually a very radical statement. After the Depression, the scope of government bureaucratization, corporatization, and rationalization of the economy increased worldwide, bolstered by the demonstration effect of the high economic growth rates of the Soviet Union and Keynesianism in the West. All these historically overdetermined conjunctures led to the emergence of new forms of social capital, which manifested themselves into mass political movements and coalitions that rejected the hegemony of the capitalist Creorder. These movements sought to contour, if not control, the Creorder to prevent the deleterious effects of its penchant for, and I quote Nitzen and Bischler, the ongoing imposition of power and therefore the dynamic transformation of society. Thus, according to Mouffe and Leclos, neoliberalism emerged to reformulate, I quote, the very articulation between liberalism and democracy. Neoliberalism, understood as an ideological defense of capitalism, sought to undermine the anti-possessive principles underpinning Keynesianism, democracy, and democratic socialism. The purpose of the neoliberal project was the resurrection of capital as a Creorder into a positive hegemonic principle. In order to do this, they sought to engage in the dialectic embedded in the logic of liberal democracy itself by re-emphasizing and reformulating the liberal subject of liberal democracy. The primary intellectual of the neoliberal reaction was Austrian-born Friedrich A. Hayek. Hayek sought to reformulate the liberal concept of homo economicus in order to save the philosophical and ethical principles of the possessive individualist subject. Consequently, he argued that his political philosophy's goal was, and I quote, as it was at the beginning of the 19th century, to free the process of spontaneous growth from the obstacles and encumbrances that human folly has erected. Interestingly, Hayek also rejected the ontological basis of possessive individualism when he argued that, and I quote, the primitive individualism prescribed by Thomas Hobbes is hence a myth. The savage is not solitary, and his instinct is collectivist. There was never war of all against all. This forced Hayek to articulate a new and stronger conception of the possessive individual. Hayek did this by arguing that subjectivity and reason is an evolutionary concept that is only maximized via market transactions. In so doing, Hayek reformulated the ethical political concept of the possessive individualist subject not as an origin, but as a historical and scientific fact built on praxis. Hayek, as Hayek argues, it was men's submission to the impersonal forces of the market that in the past has made possible the growth of civilization, which without this could not have developed. Crucially, it is this ideological position that reestablishes the dominance of the market system as an ethical principle. Hayek sees from the left to progressivism and reverses the argument by positing that any attempt to restrict the market democratically, bureaucratically, socialistically would inevitably lead to totalitarianism, undermine civilization, and thus subvert the creation of the free human subject. Hayek, at the end of Road to Serfdom, for instance, provides a clear elucidation of the goal of his hegemonic project: the reversal of the double movement, embedded in the anti-possessive ideologies of the democratic revolution and Keynesianism that was dominant by mid-century. As Hayek states, though we neither can wish nor possess the power to go back to the reality of the 19th century, we have the opportunity to realize its ideal. If in the first attempt to create a world of free men we have failed, we must try again. Hayek was ultimately successful in reformulating possessive individualism and the capitalist Creorder as a hegemonic ideology. As Gramsci notes, what was once previously secondary and subordinate and even incidental is now taken to be primary, becomes the nucleus of a new ideological and theoretical complex. Neoliberalism represents a reversal of what was then seen as secondary within the liberal democratic tradition, economic liberalism and the concept of the subject associated with it, homo economicus of the possessive individualist genus. Pierre Bourdieu argues that the successful implementation of neoliberalism depends on its ability to, and I quote, create the conditions under which the theory, neoclassical economics, can be realized and function, or a program of the methodological destruction of collectives. I hypothesize, agreeing with Bourdieu, that the erosion of social capital has been widespread under neoliberalism. Neoliberalism saw the reversal of many of the gains that the double movement had accomplished by implementing radical economic reforms, known as shock therapy, justified by neoclassical economic theory as inevitable. The most important of these advances was the formation of a vast institutionalized network of social capital embodied in the creation of counter-hegemonic ideological apparatuses like unions, political parties, and social movements, etc. These institutions brought individuals together and facilitated the creation of constitutive equivalences between individuals who had different demands, coming from different socioeconomic sectors to create new cross-class identities that fostered the counter-hegemonic subjectivities. As a result, social capital is actually quite perilous to capitalism's hegemonic project to create a Creorder because, as Robert Putnam argues, I quote, voluntary cooperation is easier in a community that has inherited a substantial stock of social capital in the forms of norms of reciprocity and networks of civic engagement. Thereby, end of quote, thereby creating non-market relations of cooperation and power. And thus, it is exactly this social capital and civic engagement that neoliberalism seeks to undermine with radical economic reforms to make the possessive individualist subject a reality. Neoliberalism, I argue, was a reaction to the failure of capital's justificatory discourse based on a possessive individualist conception of homo economicus by the mid-20th century. In order for capital to function as a Creorder, it needs not only brute material force, but it needs its mechanisms of power, that is to say, the price mechanism, and subjects of power, the possessive individual, to be as universal as possible. Therefore, neoliberalism sought ways in order to prevent a recreation of the tenuous position capital had found itself in by the middle of the 20th century, by reformulating the hegemonic conception of homo economicus and materially undermining the social capital that had been built by decades of industrialization and class struggle. The hegemony of neoclassical economics itself is not based on its scientific validity, as much of its propagation and application of the broader ethical political concepts behind liberal capitalism that have been instituted, as we all know, within the academic ISAs, or ideological state apparatuses, which creates a nearly ironclad common sense. And this is the problem. It is this ethical political concept that justifies and guides capital to create a world in its ideal image, which is neoclassical economics, of a utopian social order under the domination of the capitalist nomos. It is a world that capital realizes must be fought for and created, as it does not flow naturally from economic trajectories. Critical thinkers must fight back and challenge this logic by creating a revamped critique of capital's concept of homo economicus, but also the creation of new forms of social capital. The concepts of the Creorder and nomos are fruitful ones that should be utilized towards this end. If there is any lesson from the 20th century, it is that capital as power will not end unless it is stopped materially, but also politically and ideologically. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd really like to thank, again, those of the organizers I haven't gotten a chance to thank personally for all of your work putting this conference together. It's been tremendously useful and educational for me, so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to participate in it. I come from a different perspective on all of this than many of the speakers here this weekend. I've spent the last just about 3 decades working in movements for disarmament, against wars, sort of at the nexus between the peace and disarmament movement and the environmental movement, working against nuclear power, against nuclear weapons, and doing this in the context of small, locally grounded organizations that were working directly against particular institutions of the military-industrial complex, trying to prevent the deployment of Navy ships armed with nuclear weapons, trying to stop particular weapons facilities, but also in the strange twists and turns that one can have in an activist life, have ended up working in international networks of organizations trying to work to at least educate people about the broader implications of nuclear weapons, what they have to do with other issues, and also to educate people around the world about the effects on international treaty regimes of US nuclear and other high-tech weapons programs. And then over about the last 10 years or so, working in particular with people in South Asia as the nuclear arms race has emerged there, and in the last really particularly between 2005 and 2008, against the deal worked out that was really the linchpin of a much broader set of relationships around everything from agriculture to potential arms sales, the centerpiece of which was the US-India nuclear deal, an experience that in many ways illustrated a lot of the themes that have been discussed here this weekend. And in the midst of that, I happened to come across the global political economy of Israel, which seized my attention, and I began to read that work and everything else in the same vein that I've been able to get my hands on since. And that's how I ended up here on this particular weekend. So I'm going to try to do the hard thing, which is not really give the talk that I came with, since this is an unfamiliar venue, and I really, it's very hard, before the fact to know what will fit. But instead try to do as best I can what I think is most useful. And so this is basically going to have 2 bits. And the first bit is kind of, as an end user of social theory, also affected by the crisis of theory because it's hard to find anything that I can apply to what I'm trying to do, kind of what kind of theory it looks from here like we need now. And then the second piece will be because obviously I can't prove anything, I can only raise questions. Sort of a very sketchy attempt to build what I think is a quite possible and likely quite fruitful bridge of types of inquiry between the broad overview laid out in Capital is Power and in the other works by Nietzsche and Bickler, down to the kinds of things I try to grapple with every day. And that will be, of course, very sketchy, very provisional, just some sort of ideas about directions we might go in. But you know, part of the things, and it's too bad I don't see a lot of the people who were engaged in the debates on Friday and Saturday here today. Looking at it from the outside, I don't feel like a lot of this is ultimately irreconcilable in terms of the intentions of the lines of inquiry. I think a theory of exploitation of some kind is quite compatible with this view of how capitalist power works, but remains to be developed and made fully consistent with this kind of approach. So, you know, I would hope that we can all remember, you know, what we're here for. This isn't just a crisis of theory. This is a crisis of humanity. We are in a period where we may lose everything. We may lose ourselves. We may lose the whole web of life that we evolved depending upon. So it's a very critical moment, and we're trying to figure out together how we go forward. So, so I look at this, you know, trying to figure out, how do I answer questions I run into every day out there doing what I do? You know, how do I understand what it means when a week after 9/11, I'm speaking at the gates of the place they make the cruise missiles for TRW makes the cruise missiles in Tucson, Arizona. We're already firing in Afghanistan. And across the street, you know, as I'm speaking on the platform at this anti-war rally, are a bunch of people with all the indicia of the American working class in their dress and demeanor and everything else, and literally holding up great big signs that say, "Bombs not peace." And how do I explain the fact that, you know, 10 years later, after two horrible wars, erosion of civil liberties, collapse of the economy, we are still struggling with major elements in the US labor movement to get any commitment to anti-war work whatsoever. You know, why is that? And I need to understand why nuclear arsenals persist 2 decades after the Cold War that everybody thought was the reason for their existence, and why nuclear energy, despite its extremely well-known safety, ecological, and technical risks, remains a very popular thing, even though it's chancy from any kind of a conventional economic perspective, but it remains very attractive to elites around the world. So, you know, this is the kind of thing I'm trying to figure out how to answer. Now, in the United States, and actually many other places as well, social movement activity really is at a low ebb. In both disarmament and environmental work, movements have largely been supplanted by professionalized single-issue pressure groups deploying very conventional lobbying and campaigning techniques. Over the past few years, there's been some growing awareness that this is a problem, and there have been some efforts to build broader coalitions among groups that seem to have common interests, but so far they haven't really proven to be very coherent. They coalesce around efforts to create one or another oppositional spectacle in the form of a demonstration or campaigns, but they seldom really create a whole that is significantly greater than the sum of their NGO parts. And strategies for action seem to consist mainly of bundles of tactics, one bundle drawn from the standard repertory I was just talking about of, you know, interest group campaigning and lobbying, and the other seemingly designed to recreate images from social movements past without a great deal of reflection on the meaning of those movements or the moments when they left their most vivid documentary trace, which in turn is preserved for us by institutions that have different purposes entirely. And so what's missing is any sustained discussion of how cause and effect actually works in society today and how we make social change. And this requires an analysis of how the existing political and economic institutions function and an analysis of the role that organized activity to change those institutions can play. And those are not the same thing, and it is the difference between those that I believe was the linchpin of a lot of the arguments that were going on Thursday and Friday. Because one of the things actually that's very, very fruitful about this set of work that we're here discussing in large part is that it's very, very clear that it is this top-down and view of the top view of how capitalist power works as capitalist power, what the rulers are doing when they rule, and that this works on the rest of society in this constant process of ordering and reordering that is always in relation to the state, but also changing the state, that is always in relationship to the rest of the world, but also changing it. And so what that means is the world in which we are trying to organize is being constantly reordered. And we have to be thinking about what kinds of oppositional efforts we can make in relation to that as well. And it's very difficult to abandon. So I was thinking about, where is the heat coming from in this argument? Why is, because it's not just here, why is there this passionate commitment to a concept like surplus value as a fundamental category of analysis for even figuring out how opposition works? And there's all of the positive potential normative weight that it carries. The concept of exploitation is a normative category. And there was the hope of this kind of unified field theory of society that you would get, where you could simultaneously explain the workings of capitalist power and at the same time create through that critique the motivational force needed to build the opposition to it. And that is something that I think under current conditions we have to go back and look at and think about again. I think we do indeed need a concept of exploitation. I am not so sure you can develop it out of a single homogeneous concept of exploitation that works with the same set of categories that help you explain how the whole system of power works. And that's something that is clearly worthy of thinking through very carefully. So that's one piece where if you're really going to have this engagement between the Marxists and the people with this position, to me at least, looking from the outside, it seems to me like that's the terrain where it happens. So, all of this, I need to be able to use, I hope, to understand, not only the obstacles to change and the possible alliances we might want to pursue, but again, to understand the kind of change we want to make. And what the analysis does in terms of, again, creating the narrative out of which you build the motivational structures to build the movement is it helps people identify the common causes of what seem to be very, very different and particularized grievances, allowing the formation of social movements with some kind of a broader strategy for social change. And this, again, is where new thinking about political economy comes back into the formation of social opposition. But, here I sit, and there's this gap approaching about the width of the Pacific Ocean between left social theory, which has largely retreated into the universities, and forms of activism, again, that either follow professional NGO roles and practices or ritualized forms of protest, neither of which appear to have any kind of a strategy rooted in any particularly coherent vision of cause and effect whatsoever. And today, where are we sitting? We have half of humanity living in cities. And, getting back again to the concept of, sort of forgot this bit, about surplus value and exploitation, right? This was all rooted in a world where pretty much everyone, 90+% of the population was living still in rural communities. Just about everyone had enough was no more than a generation or two away from that kind of experience where even if it was hierarchical, the reciprocity of human experience was intrinsically recognized, as was the fact that we get our livelihood collectively by natural processes from the planet. And so the normative piece of that critique made visceral common sense, or could be made to make visceral common sense. And now we're generations further along in this vast collective social science experience that is planet Earth now, experiment, with half of humanity living in cities and even more dependent on systems for energy, transportation, food, and other necessities developed by very large organizations whose structure and technology choices have been shaped to sustain an inequitable distribution of power and wealth. And conversely, it appears that those organizational forms and their typical technology choices present irresistible opportunities for people in their upper reaches to obtain privileged wealth shares in a variety of social and national contexts, regardless how those types of organizations are juridically defined. And I'll talk about this if I have time a little more later. Nuclear establishments all over the world share very, very interesting characteristics, regardless of whether they're state organizations or private organizations or hybrid organizations. They deploy similar combinations of technology, organizational technique, and ideology to extract a privileged wealth share from the rest of the world around them. And again, if I have time, I'll argue how that fits in as a set of categories to begin to operationalize this larger scheme, at the kind of level where I can get a grip on it. And further, the various ideologies that legitimate the inequality inherent in this order of things have depended on the premise of endless growth of material production engendered by the onward march of science and technology, which in turn is represented as a process which is natural and neutral. And this unlimited growth paradigm, of course, now appears unsustainable due to both resource and ecological limits, which is just what Tim was talking about yesterday. Now, despite these, manifest challenges, I have not encountered much in the way of new visions in the organizing and campaigning context that I work in. On the one hand, we have variations of change the nameplate on the door forms of socialism or social democracy with adequate adjustments in the technology mix assumed to flow from more democratic control over the immense organizations that currently sustain most of us. On the other hand, we have an array of approaches that stress the relocalization of both production and politics. And these so far have put forward no transition program, or really neither a transition program for technology and social organization that seems readily adaptable for hundreds of millions of people living close to the subsistence level without a land base. And they also haven't put forward a politics that envisions how the transition might be accomplished on a large scale by any means more deliberate and less catastrophic than widespread collapse of the current order. And sort of the conundrum really was posed by one person, one way this was looked at was William McNeill in the conclusions of his book, The Pursuit of Power, almost 30 years ago now. And he said, basically, he was looking at previous waves of anti-capitalist social movements, and he said they'd been ineffective in inventing viable alternatives to bureaucratic corporate management. Cheap mass-produced goods required flow-through technology which only large-scale bureaucratically managed corporations could sustain, and a world safe for such behemoths must presumably regulate their actions bureaucratically as well. And then he basically was saying, ooh, that's terrible. In a world and over against the immense organized force the prevailing order could generate, the price of survival for even the most incandescently revolutionary group was the generation of its own power-wielding internal bureaucracy, and bureaucratically organized revolutionaries, if genuinely powerful, found themselves swiftly co-opted into the labyrinthine tasks of state management. So how do we avoid just trading in one form of undemocratic rule for another? And is another world that is much different from this one really possible? And can we get there in any way other than a catastrophic transition? I mean, for me, these are the big questions of the moment. And, you know, for me, I found this body of work as something that is useful in beginning to try to answer these questions. And I only have 5 minutes, so I won't even get to give you examples, but I'll try to give, you know, a high point sketch. So one of the things that I immediately seized upon, and I was very much aided by, you know, one of these, you know, hit me on the head to make it obvious to me things of the first book, The Global Political Economy of Israel, which laid out much the same theoretical scheme in several theoretical chapters as is in the new book, and then gave this set of applications around the things I work on, around the military-industrial complex and its relationship to other industries and the possible interests in this concept of the weapon dollar, petrodollar coalition, and so forth. And I looked at this idea of differential accumulation, and what popped into my head was, well, gee, how do these different sectors of capital compete? How do you identify them? How do they compete, right? And again, the books posit a world in which corporations and organs of the state are the concrete incarnations of the capitalist mode of power. So I said, all right, we'll start disaggregating both the state and capital and start looking for these sets of alliances that form themselves across this boundary, which of course is exactly what I'm looking at in, you know, the everyday social movement stuff that you do if you're doing peace and disarmament work. And so, you know, basically you're situated, you're beginning this analysis here in the global metropole, you know, the developed part of the world where the vast majority of the population long since has been separated from control over the means by which they sustain their existence, from direct control. Now in the rest of the world, and this is very important to think about all the time, and Tim DeMuzio wrote about this piece in the article thinking about these concepts, about 3 years ago, I think it was. The process of separating people from control of the means of maintaining their existence is ongoing, whatever you want to call it, primitive accumulation, accumulation by dispossession, or another particular aspect of this broader accumulation process. I'm trying to think of how to sum this up in 2 minutes. It's truly a difficult task. Anyway, first of all, at the first level, I want people to start, I hope, thinking about organizations form strategies in which they deploy particular combinations of advanced technology, organizational technique, and ideology. And you were talking about one of the particular elements of this in a combined kind of organizational and ideological strategy in the market sphere. And they're different. They form different particular alliances, and alliance formation is a particular element, in particular, of organizational technique. It's why big organizations are full of lawyers and lobbyists and everything else, you know, and there's thousands of them, and they're a significant part of the organizational structure because this alliance formation is fundamental to the modern form of how things work. And extracting a privileged wealth share from the rest of society by selling high-tech weapons to the state, which in turn extracts taxes from the state's population, entails a different particular mix of technologies, organizational techniques, ideologies, and alliances than selling health insurance and healthcare services, or educational services, or computer software, or agricultural commodities. And I think you can get a lot of mileage out of starting to think about what those particular strategies are. Now, another piece, and indulge me a little time so I can just sort of rip through the outline of this, is an important characteristic of these organizations, whether state or corporate, is that they require these large numbers of skilled and educational people to function. And there have been various attempts for the last, I don't know, 70 years to get a grip on this phenomenon. First, actually looking at it in the context of bureaucratic collectivism and the new classes. What is the significance of these upper echelons of these big organizations? And I think this is an important piece too, because I think the strategies have to work for them. And in terms of actual modern polities and really the shape of consumption as well, because these elements are the key global consumers. Remember Herman talking about that top 10%, somewhere between, I don't know what the number is, but somewhere less than 20, somewhere 10 to 20% are buying all the flat screen TVs, the Lexuses, all this kind of stuff. The organizations are selling to each other and their top tier employees, this sort of permanent echelon. And then you have this really two-tier economy, and everybody else is fungible labor or objects to be instrumentally dealt with one way or another. And these folks also are in some ways ideologically bound to their sectors. They tend to stay in them. They may move from, again, across the boundary between the state and a private organization in a revolving door, but they tend to stay in their sector, and that is a whole bunch of stuff that I think has political significance, and I have a lot more to say about that, but I have don't have time. And so all of those questions about what is the boundary of the organization, what is the organization really, who really is the capitalist organization that is ruling, those are important, and they're important not just in the old kind of managerial capital versus absentee ownership sense, but in this sense as well. Let's see if there's anything else that I really need to say. Yeah, I'll say one last thing, which I'll really have to say cryptically. This concept of capitalization as a dynamic and ongoing process and its effect on the rest of the world. 2 weeks ago, I was writing a paper about civil society, the state of civil society and its relationship to disarmament. And both in everything I was reading, and there's a whole literature on why politics is broken everywhere, from China, it works differently inside the party now, to Peter Mayer's stuff about, the hollowing out of politics in the West, to people writing in Russia about the new form of state that's just, rent-seeking organizations at the top and a subordinated, engineered consent at the bottom. There's something different going on. And this is generally thought of conventionally in terms of just corporate globalization and how difficult it is to, get power that can counter transnational organizations because they're transnational. I just want to also put out there the speculation that there's something, 0 minutes, I understand. There's something much more fundamental going on here that has to do, we've reached some point in this transformation of the relationship between capital and the state. The conventional form of social movements has been making claims on the state or for state power, and so politics, as we have traditionally practiced it, has been disrupted as well.
Great, thank you very much. Also, I already have 3 people on the speakers list. I guess the precedent set yesterday is to have 1 question, 1 answer. Is that okay with the panel? Yeah. Okay. So have Troy first.
I'm going to abuse my sitting at the front position, I guess. I want to thank Andrew, actually. I think that was a perfect way to kind of finish the presentations when, as much as we may be rejecting Marx's labor theory of value, it's come up in several places. I think we all agree that the point of the world is to change it, and presumably we all want to change it into a more humane world. Maybe some of you have designs on, being emperor, but I think mostly we want to make the world a better place. And so my bona fides are as a bit of a lapsed activist. As a parent and a PhD student, I haven't been actively active in activist movements lately. But when I have been involved in those movements, the objects have typically been fairly limited. The last thing that I was most actively involved in was books to prisoners, which, if you just look at the actual activity, it becomes really difficult to see what are you actually achieving here. It's not, We're not going and tearing down the walls of the prison. What is really happening? At the same time, I'd like to believe we were making the lives of the people who are living within this system a little bit better. And so in that way, it's a reform. And it's a reform, however, that's informed by radicalism. And it's not informed by reformism, it's a reform informed by radicalism. And I think, like Randy, I'm generally an optimist. And the reason I'm an optimist is because people have been fighting for and winning alleviations to the brutal conditions of their lives for a long time. And in the 20th century, we've seen some pretty significant social movements that have achieved a lot. And when people only look at capitalism or the current state of the world and see the shit, I think they denigrate the victories that have been achieved. I think we also have to remember that those victories weren't achieved in reformist ways. They weren't achieved by petitioning the state to please give this. They were taken. These reforms were taken. That said, capitalism has had no problem encompassing all of these changes within its infrastructure. And I think that's because the focus has never been on the fundamental process which I think capitalist power calls attention to, which is capitalization. Capital was always able to capitalize this new social order. It involved a restructuring. Certain powerful figures of the pre-order fell, others rose, and the capitalist infrastructure as a whole remained. So I think revolution will really require challenging this fundamental process, which I think rests on private property, as Marx recognized long ago, and then the quantification of that private property based on forward-looking expectations that render it vendable. So it's not just a matter of owning the land, it's that that land becomes divisible and vendable. So I could actually divide myself. So right now I am offering for $10,000, 5% of my future life earnings. Any takers? So I could capitalize myself. It's challenging those basic institutions. And again, here obviously we're returning back to an age-old claim. We need to challenge the institution of private property, but we also need to challenge the practice of quantification as it's been claimed by the capitalists. I don't think we can challenge quantification in and of itself. However, and this is where I'm going to get to a question.
Thank you. Your first presentation was great, and so was the second one, but thanks for the question.
So my question is now going to go to Nicholas, and this is based on your use of the concept of social capital.
Right.
Given, I think, how radically Nitzen and Bickler confront the concept of capital and change the way we understand the concept of capital, how do you make that commensurable with the use of the term social capital, which is presumably also motivated by a desire to make the world a more humane place, when capital is the fundamental institution of the very thing that we're presumably opposed to?
Well, social capital isn't an economic category. Social capital is a concept of social relations between individuals. Because it's a common useful term. I'm not wedded to the term. I'm using it because it's a term that's used in academia generally. But the concept is not an economic concept. And I think, in my opinion, if we need a new term, fine, let's make a new term out of it. I have no problem with that. But I think the general concept is legitimate, and it's actually a very important concept. One of the things I think people on the left tend to do is that we tend to denigrate ourselves by saying, oh, well, it's a crisis of theory, it's a crisis of capital, and it's true, there is. But at the same time, we have the reality of a different structure, social structure that is unique in history, that has probably never existed at this level before, of abstraction and of fragmentation of in the social body. One of the things that the reason why I use social capital is that with neoliberal reforms, you've had the emergence of very fragmented labor. You have the emergence of part-time work, service sector work, non-factory work, etc. And so the traditional forms of solidarity or social capital are eroded. significantly. In the 19th century, people would say, well, you had a very fundamentally puritanical market system. Well, possibly, but you also had the institutions at the social level that engendered social capital, for instance, factories. And Robert Putnam talks about this in Making Democracy Work, that in northern Italy, you had very large factories that also helped generate social capital. And it was this movement, this ability to communicate with the same people over and over and over and over again. And if you go to Ernesto Laclau's work on populism, for instance, it's this interaction between, this real physical interaction between individuals that creates the equivalences between individuals to help them understand the world in a much more radical way. And what I'm arguing essentially is that neoliberalism is destroying that. That's the problem. We on the left are not seriously taking into consideration the fact that we're dealing with different structures, that individuals cannot talk to each other the way they used to talk to each other. This is not the 20th century. This is the point I'm talking about. You're right, the 20th century was characterized, and the 19th century as well, by this progressive movement. But why did it stop in the 80s and 70s? Because you had neoliberalism. You had a fundamental change in structures of work. You had a fundamental change in structures of the way people interact. And I think one of the excellent works on this is Robert Putnam's work, Bowling Alone. He talks about that. He talks about the way that you have in society a general individualization of social relations. And so I think what we have to understand is that the left, yes, we have a crisis of theory, but there's also something that's out of our control to some degree. That we're dealing with a different social structure, and I think what we need to do is we need to find new ways of building social capital in order for people to come together and build these equivalences. That's what I think.
Thank you. So I have 5 people on the speakers list and about 10 minutes left, so please try to keep your questions short. Jason?
Okay. So I believe that I'm asking the three of you the same question, and it's about particulars. There's an element to, like, wedding rings, that if a diamond is so beautiful, you can't actually buy a big diamond because there's no way to create a setting to hold it. It'll fall out. You can't create the fineness of the gold so that the diamond falls out. So in one sense, the wedding ring market for diamonds all have to be roughly the same size. If it's so cheap, you can't get a big diamond because it'll just fall off the ring. That's a strange question, but just a second. When you have the interest in nuclear power, right, you're trying to supplant the coal plant that's producing the electricity. But the amount of wasted energy to get the electricity down the line is incredible. And one of the things that talks about, I won't talk about solar because we'll just leave it alone. One of the things that shows up is that if you really wanted an efficient grid, you need micro generators throughout each suburb so that the electrical path is measured in hundreds of meters and there's no waste. So in one sense, I'm not dealing with nuclear part of the power, but in terms of the centralization of the grid, the easiest solution to fix the problem is to replace a coal burner with a nuclear burner. But no one wants to realize the fact that no kids, suburbia has to change fucking now. Now, the next question for you, there's all the same question in my crazy mind. The question is, but even market microstructure analysts say it's a zero-sum game when you're measuring trades, when you're looking at the bid and ask side of the trades and options and futures and stocks. So in one sense, trying to change the power of the market in terms of a social interaction, the tease is even the micro market analysts say, but there isn't anything there. And I wink. The point is, there are these structural constraints of which one says, the structural constraints where De Beers is selling you something valuable, but you can't actually buy it, a big one, right? And so you can't show off. Nuclear power is supposed to save the world, regardless of all the structural problems with it. But heck, the real problem is everyone needs to make electricity in their neighborhood. And in one sense, if you think the market's bad, even the market microstructural analysts say, but there's nothing there. It's still a fiction. It's a zero-sum game. When you're going through your theories, can you see how do you handle the fact that there are these physical consequences which constrain your choice of theory? I hope, in those 3 ways of asking the same question, that it made sense. But anyhow, I have to be quiet.
Can I take a stab at this one? I'm not really sure I understand your question, so I'll try to answer sort of generically, right? I mean, I will get I'm kind of a bonehead in a lot of ways, and what I'm trying to do is make arguments to get people who do social movement work, who I think are pretty good-hearted, to work on things that matter rather than on things that don't, right? Pretty simple thing, but really, really difficult. Or maybe I'm just bad at it, but it seems I've been at this for a long time, and it's hard to do. So again, looking at something like nuclear power, there's endless technical critique of nuclear power, and there's endless technological alternatives to nuclear power. Most of this discourse took place before the global warming. I mean, I see Tim going there, and he's absolutely right. You have all kinds of problems like do we even have enough oil in the ground to build the solar stuff and so forth. I'm familiar with those debates. But bracketing that for a second, all right? You have to take the baby step before you can take the big step. You have to get people thinking about why did the technology choices get made? And you have, the well-established literature, which was because it works for capitalists to de-skill labor and so forth. But it's really much bigger than that, right? It's really, you have these structures where identifiable sectors of elites, this is why this analysis, works for me in large part, are carving out for themselves a kind of defensible node on the top-tier economy in the global metropole. And I really started noticing this when I looked at the nuclear sector in South Asia. And the South Asian people I work with are writing about this. They call it the nuclear enclave. You have this identifiable portion of the post-colonial elite that was able to elevate themselves up right out of their societies by this particular set of organizational strategies where the technologies, they're a D- as a technology, but in terms of organizational technique and ideology, they're tremendously powerful. In these contexts, the linkage to nuclear weapons is a plus, not a minus. It means you can hide your mistakes behind the veil of government secrecy. You have direct access and cross-subsidization from the state. There are all these organizational advantages. This is a long example I could give you, okay? So you have to get people understanding you are not going to win this battle by making technical arguments that solar is better. You have to critique the structures. I used to teach environmental law, and I was saying, railroads and intelligent urban design have been around for 150 years. This is a physics problem. Move the least possible mass, the least possible distance. You talk about this in the book too. Move the least possible mass, the least possible distance, and design your cities in a compact way. What do? We get something that maximizes work because it maximizes collective market share. Electric cars, more electric plants to put electricity into electric cars, and so on down the road. A whole ensemble of complementary strategies.
Thank you. I get it now.
Yeah.
I understand my question and your answer.
Right.
Okay. Maybe I could ask the people asking questions to imagine themselves being on Fox News. Jordan, you have 30 seconds.
I just wanted to thank the panelists. Really, really interesting presentations. Troy, your work is a beautiful symphony of qualitative and quantitative analysis, and I think it's a great example of the power of this new research program. My question is for Nicolas, actually. There was an amazing overview of so many different thinkers. And I wonder two things. How much time do you think? How much time do you think about freedom? I mean, how much do you think about freedom? Because you're talking about the subject, and that seems to me to be a real weakness on the left. And related to that is Alain Badiou. Have you ever read his work, especially on Paul and the foundations of universalism? Because it seems to fit right in with what you're saying.
Well, I have to read more about you, that's for sure. I have read some of him. The concept of freedom, as in the idea that humans make themselves, I actually critique Nicolas Saldias on that. One of the things that they say in the book is we can't predict how people will react because of free human creativity or something of that nature. And I'm not saying that's wrong. But one of my arguments, I'm going back to the controversial term of social capital, is that, no, actually, yes, people are free, but at the same time, they're structured. And in order for them, we can build or we can imagine structures that are conducive to change and structures that are not conducive to change. And what I'm arguing is that in order for us on the left to actualize this change, we have to realize that we live in a structured society, and capitalism as a Creorder, and this is where I think Nicolas and Saldias do a really good job, is that capitalism is always changing, and it's changing because it has to change. And one of the things that capitalism did, and what I'm arguing here, and I think Hayek really does a good job of explaining how capital may have thought at the time in the 60s, was that structural change was necessary in order to prevent the same structures that were emerging in the post-Second World War world of unionization, of full employment, of socialization, etc. I have examples in my actual essay of this. I'm not just blah, blah, blah. For example, look at Chile, 1970, Allende. We're talking about a country that was structurally protected from the market, the international market. Industry was protected. And also labor unions were very active supporters of that structure. So what did Pinochet, Hayek, remember Hayek was one of the people who supported Pinochet, who said, I'd rather see a liberal dictatorship than a democracy without liberalism. So what is it that was happening? My opinion is that, number one, in Chile, with the establishment of the industrial ISI policies, you had the creation of new forms of social capital embodied in factories, embodied in unions, embodied in other forms of social cooperation between people who were politically becoming a hegemonic core. They were creating new identities and new ideologies that were challenging the very logic of capital. And you saw that happen in 1970 with the election of Allende, okay? And what happened? Well, Althusser talks about that. The ISAs, the traditional ideological state apparatuses that are to interpolate individuals to be capital subjects, failed because the structures were changed radically in Chile, and it happened all over Latin America. It wasn't just Chile. What happened? Well, as Althusser would note, well, when the ISAs fail, what comes instead? The RSAs. The repressive state apparatuses come. And that's exactly what happened in Chile, what happened in Argentina, what happened in Uruguay. These countries were very different countries than they are today, certainly. And the whole point of neoliberalism, in my opinion, agreeing with Bourdieu, is to destroy those structures, those social structures of equivalences, to destroy the very identities that human beings were creating outside of the market. And this is one thing we have to understand. Not everything is a Creorder, not everything is capitalization. There are things outside of it. It's the structures of human relations, the creation of social capital, and the creation of trust between people that creates political alternatives. And neoliberalism, and if you read the paper, I give examples, destroyed those alternatives. Because today it's inconceivable to imagine what was possible in 1970. We can't imagine that the Communist Party of Italy could have won in 1976. We can't imagine today a Marxist being elected president of a country anywhere, never mind in Chile, especially Chile today. And this is what I talk about. Because one of the things that you look at in Chile is you start noticing that in Chile, it has the second lowest support of the market system in Latin America. 90% of the population does not want the privatization of pensions. The list goes on and on and on and on. You have in the country a base, this is the problem. You have in Chile the antagonism. You have hatred of the system. You have people who don't want it, who don't like it, but nothing's coming of it. Why? The reason why I argue nothing's coming of it is because Chile, as the exemplar of neoliberal reforms, the neoliberal reforms were in two parts. Number one, shock out of the system with the destruction of organic intellectuals of the left. And number two, it was also shocked out of the system by massive free market reforms, destroying that the social material base of the social capital that once supported the counter-hegemonic discourses that were prominent in Chile at the time. If we on the left want to understand what the problem is, it's not so much only in theory, but it's also in reality, that there's a material problem out there, that it's a structural problem by neoliberal reforms.
I just want to say something very short that sort of complements this, which is again, there are things that we could do 30 years ago that we can't do anymore because the social basis isn't there to do them. And this type of consideration has very concrete consequences for very specific choices of how you spend your time and money. You know, do you organize big events on a national level, which assumes that you can evoke a normatively and materially based set of potentials for resistance that are already there? Or do you say, you know, they've really been damaged and broken up, and we have to go back and start rebuilding face-to-face human scale context where people can start learning all over again how to really practice democracy, how to make decisions together about something hard, how to trust each other enough so, you know, I can take care of your kid if you get put in jail. You know, you don't build that kind of trust on an internet meetup. You know, and so it has real consequential choices for how you spend your time.
Jung-Chul?
It is about the comment about the Hayek. I think many people have a grave misunderstanding about Hayek. Actually, many people believe that Hayek is the originator of the neo-classical economy. It is not true. It is Friedman. So the reason is that Hayek definitely object fractional reserve. It means that he is more revolutionary than the Keynes. He object the capitalist form of market, capitalist form of banking. I think it leads us to think of the future community that the other panel is present that. I found many positive implications from the liberal thought. Of course, not from the Lockean form of liberal thought. That they imagine that some community in which the corporate politics doesn't dominate the social relation. So I think it is positive implication to me to imagine another vision of a community. Yeah.
Right, like this. Okay, 30 seconds. Okay. Well, Hayek is not the originator of neoclassical economics, certainly not. But I think what he was doing, and he criticized neoclassical economics as well. But the point of Hayek was and he states, and I quote here, is to recreate the classical liberal society of the 19th century. He wants to create a society of atomistic competitors because this is where human reason evolves from. This is a fundamental statement. This is actually really radical, where he goes, look, if you stop the market in any way, you're actually being anti-rational. And so there is where Hayek takes a ethical political statement of great value. That's where I think where the left has kind of a problem, because he says, look, the market is the originator of all reason. And so that's, to me, what Hayek really represents. It's not so much about his economics, but about what he represents in an ethical political plane ideologically to build a new hegemony. And I think he has been successful in that by changing our conception of the market subject quite successfully, at least in my opinion. So.
Okay, Jonathan?
Yes, 2 points. One quick point. we certainly do not claim that you cannot predict people. On the contrary, capital constantly predicts the behavior of the masses of humanity quite successfully. This is precisely what we mean by the mega machine. What we said is that you cannot really predict acts of freedom against the system because they're autonomous acts. So just to correct that point. The second thing that I wanted to say, and I don't know that this is a question, but I think it's a clarification. I think you're making a big mistake that is similar to the mistake that the communists made in the Soviet Union. You adopt the very ideology that you seek to counteract, and I think Troy alluded to, by using their concept. You know, the idea of stocks versus flow is the idea that was articulated by Irving Fisher at the turn of the century. Then we have Gary Becker talking about human capital. And then we have the whole slew of people who jumped on the neoclassical bandwagon without even knowing it, people like Bourdieu, who are speaking about social capital. So essentially, you're using the very terminology of the capitalists to say everything is capital, exactly what Fisher suggested. It's just that we have good capital and bad capital. Now, the difference between you and the capitalists is the capitalists know how to quantify it, and you have no idea how to quantify it, so you have to use their own techniques. And essentially what will happen is that you will be left with no alternative categories, and you will become predictable.
Respond? Sure. I think just because it's called social capital doesn't mean it's actually capital.
Call it that.
But like I said to you when I responded, I'm not using the term as my own term. I'm using it as a concept.
But it's a very problematic term.
I'm not denying it's a problematic term. I'm not denying it's a problematic term. But I'm saying to you is that the concept is not invalid because of the term. The form may be problematic, but the content isn't, at least in my opinion. Now, it's my opinion, right? Okay. So what I think we have to understand is that what they're trying to say is that there are social relations between people, and that social relations between people, according to at least the research done by Robert Putnam, he has been able to quantify it, or at least he's attempted to quantify this relationship, okay? And so what happens is that these people who are interacting with each other build trust. That's something that is an intangible asset, right? It's not something you can measure. So just because I can't measure it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think Althusser says it very well when he goes, the structure is seen through its effects. Just because you can't measure it does not mean the structure doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that the relations between two people that cannot be quantified doesn't exist. Social capital to me, the actual term may be problematic, fine. But the point is that, yes, there is a relation. When you have a relationship with somebody, like a friend, over time, the relationship builds trust.
Who's denying that? Who's saying anything different than that?
The point is, well, but that's what I'm saying as well. I don't know what the problem is. I'm saying that the content is not, that's what I'm trying to say. The content is right, just because the term may be social capital.
But what I'm saying that when you use that term, you're importing a massive baggage of meaning with capital as a practice. And so you're using the term, and I have no doubt that it's, you know, that we share the same goals of a humane post-capitalist world. But when you, just that very term carries so much with it that I think Jonathan and Shimshan's work explicates that.
Maybe this is a discussion we can have over lunch, or because we're 15 minutes over time. So, so thank you very much for it. Would anyone in the room object if we convene at 1 p.m., so only a half-hour lunch? Just so that we can add another half hour or so to the round table, because I was told that Jonathan would like to make a presentation or a summary. Or
sorry for interrupting, Sean. The idea was we're out of panelists now. We've reorganized the day, so we want to take a quick break for lunch. We're going to reorganize the room and then come back and talk about basically recap the conference, maybe some theoretical issues to think about, and maybe future research objectives as well. So maybe if we could meet here just in about 30, 35 minutes. For 1 o'clock, we can then talk for an hour to an hour and a half and wrap things up. If that works for everyone, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Conservatism